You're listening to Today at Museum of the Bible. These exclusive conversations with authors, scholars, and specialists visiting the museum focus on how they are currently engaging with the Bible in their lives and work.
Welcome to Today at Museum of the Bible. I'm Charlotte Clay.
And I'm Jeff Cloa.
Today we are joined by Dr. Ben Witherington. Considered among the top Bible scholars in the world, he is Amos Professor of New Testament for Doctoral Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary and Professor Emeritus at St. Andrews University in Scotland. Dr. Witherington, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Now, you made a really interesting recent discovery while examining an inscription during a visit to Turkey. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, be glad to. My friend Mark Wilson and I have sort of bombed all over Turkey going to archaeological sites. And we were in the town of Yalbach. That's the modern city, which is right adjacent to the Pisidian Antioch biblical site. And it's a tiny little museum. You can't squeeze everything that they have into the museum. So there's all this stuff out in the courtyard, right? And mostly inscription stones, right? So we're walking along and we come to this inscription stone that says El Sergius Paulus, but actually it says Paulii, as in father and son or several generations of it. And of course that rings an immediate bell because this is the governor of Syria referred to in Acts 13. And so a little light went on, a little light bulb went off in my brain. And I said, first of all, I said to the curator of the museum, would you please put this in the museum, some important place? Because it's the only object you have that's actually of biblical importance from that period. Wow. And so he was very glad to hear this. He was excited and he brought it into the museum. So I go away for a year, right? And then I come back. And when I get there, there's this huge celebration. They're having some kind of art exhibit, and the mayor's there, and the governor of the region is there, and a representative from the central government in Ankara is there, film crew is there. I mean, I'm in my shorts and my T-shirt and my hat.
Did they know you were coming?
No.
Oh, okay.
They had no clue I was coming at all. And my guide, me and my guide, we're there, and my tour group, right? So when they found out I was there, they went and freaked out. They went, oh, we have to film you because we've got this in the museum,
right,
just as you asked. And I get into the room. There's only one big room in this whole museum, and it's centrally located. Here's the stone, the Sergius Paulus stone, and then below it there's an inscription that says, reference to St. Paul in Byzantine 6th century Greek. There's only four things wrong with that.
Just
First
four.
of all, it's not about St. Paul.
Right.
It's about a governor that he met. Secondly, it's not in Byzantine Greek, even close. This is first century Latin. Thank you very much. And so, I was freaking out. I was going, okay, I have to keep my mouth shut because I'm standing next to the mayor and the governor and the representative from Ankara who misidentified it as something it wasn't. Right behind this stone, huge map of Paul's missionary journeys, including his trip to Pisidian Antioch. And I'm going, well, that can stay. That's okay. And so I talked to my guide and I said, please whisper to the curator, you've got to change the identification tag below this inscription stone. He said, I will do that later.
You didn't say, hey, I'm a professional museum advisor. Let me tell you what this is.
Exactly. No, he promised to do that. Now, I don't know if he's done it. Haven't been back since
You're going
then.
back next year, right?
I'm going back next year.
Yeah.
We shall see what we shall see. If not, I'm going to take a chisel and peel off the label and fix it myself.
We can print one for you to take along.
Well, exactly. Yeah. So here's the interesting thing about that, okay? It cannot be an accident that Paul on his first missionary journey is taken to Cyprus by Barnabas, which is his home country, and they go to Salamis, and then they walk across the southern coast of Cyprus, and then they get to Paphos, which is the governing center, which is where El Sergius Paulus is, and they meet the governor, who is very interested in Eastern religions and has been mesmerized by a local magician named Amos, who's a magician, right? And Paul immediately knows this guy is not good for the governor. So there's the story about him blinding Elymas, who's misleading, spiritually misleading, religiously misleading the governor. And the governor goes, Shazam, I'd better listen to Paul. Yeah. So he listens to the testimony about the gospel. And this is actually the first juncture in the whole book of Acts. It's not in Acts 9, it's not in Acts 10. It's not until he starts talking to Sergius Paulus that we hear Saul, who is also called Paul, right? So, first of all, the name change has nothing to do with his conversion. This is a person who was a Roman citizen who had a Latin name to begin with, as his parents did, who were also Roman citizens. That's point number one. So he has a Jewish name named after King Saul, and he has a homophonic near sound alike, which would be Paulus, or in Greek, Paulos. Interesting thing about that, the root meaning of the Hebrew word Saul is short. The root meaning of the word Paulos is shorty, right? Right? So the reason he couldn't just do Saulos in Greek is because that means to walk like a prostitute. This doesn't work if you're a missionary.
I did not know that, Ben.
Yeah.
Yes, this is true.
Wow.
So next closest, let's go with the P word, Paulus. It's actually a name, both in Greek, Paulos or Paulus. And so, I mean, Paul introduces himself and says, well, what a coincidence. Your name is Paulus. My name is also Paulus. They hit it off. And we're told that Sergius Paulus embraced the Word of God. Now, what happens next? Paul and Barnabas get on a boat with John Mark. They go to Perga. Well, actually, they go to Attalia, which is modern-day Antalya, the beach town on the southern coast of Turkey. And right next to that is the ancient Greek city of Perga, right? What does the text say? Did they evangelize Perga? Plenty of people there to evangelize. Oh, no. They made a beeline right down the center of the town to the Via Sebast and started heading north over the mountains, 4,000-foot mountains, 120 miles, to a tiny little nowhere one-stoplight town called Pisidian Antioch. Okay? Picture this. Why? It's the hometown of Sergius Paulus, and probably Paul has a letter of introduction from the august governor and most famous citizen of the town of Pisidian Antioch. Talk about having a letter of introduction.
Right.
That's it right there. And we're told in Acts 13 that the first time that he spoke, he was extremely well received by the Gentiles. Now, we happen to know, in addition to all of that, that Sir William Ramsay found a stone just outside of Pisidian Antioch that mentions the Pauli, the family of Sergius Paulus, and in particular the son who had a role in the city as well. So this is a clan. This is not just one man, right? Then there's a boundary stone in Rome that mentions L. Sergius Paulus, the curator of the Tiber, early in the 40s. So now we actually can chart his course in life. He begins small as a curator of a river for a year. Then he's appointed as a provincial governor. And then we may know either the next step of his life or more likely something that his son did, because we now have evidence that in AD 70, the Council Suffectus in Rome, that is, somebody who stood in for the council, one of the consuls in Rome, because he died. Consul Suffectus is the substitute consul for a short period of time. We now have an inscription mentioning him in 70 AD. When was Paul in Cyprus? Well, about 47, 48 AD. Before that, Sergius Paulus would have been in Rome. He's working up what is called the cursus honorum, the ladder of success in the Roman Empire. And then his son, because of the success of Sergius Paulus being a good governor, in fact, his son becomes an appointed head head consul in Rome itself.
Yeah.
So we know the story of the family,
Right.
which
Wow.
is really, really remarkable. And then, if you do enough research on L. Sergius Paulus, you learn that he was a person who was interested not only in religion, but natural history. He wrote a textbook on natural history. He was good friends with Pliny the Elder, who wrote the most famous textbook on natural history from that whole period. Poor old Pliny the Elder got too curious about Mount Vesuvius right in 79 AD and made an ass of himself.
Right.
He was killed. He had his servants row up near to the
closer
mountain
to it,
and
right.
was
Right.
burned to death, right?
Wow.
But the interesting thing is that in Pliny's natural history, he mentions his interest in Cyprus as a place where magicians are thick as thieves.
Really? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So now you're going, okay, so he's the friend of Sergius Paulus, who also wrote a book on natural history in the 1st century AD. And if he has read Pliny the Elder, then this is why he's interested in magicians, which are apparently fairly common in Cyprus as religious people, right? I mean, if you put all these pieces of the puzzle together,
Right.
suddenly you have an explanation for why in the world would Paul and Barnabas make a beeline over 4,000-foot mountains, up Roman roads to Pisidian Antioch to speak to that town, when they could have just gone along the coast to Sidon and to the hometown of Paul, Tarsus, and then through the Cilician gates back to Antioch. So much easier.
Right.
And I think you also indirectly get a reason why Mr. John Mark was not up for climbing the mountains all the way to Pisidian Antioch. You know why? Because it's a dangerous trek. There are bandits in that whole area of Pamphylia and Pisidia. You know, he just wanted to go home. After Cyprus, he was good to go. He went home. Probably, if they had simply gone down the coast and gone back to Antioch, then he would have done that and then gone back to Jerusalem from Antioch. But in other words, the story now makes better sense as a result of this inscription.
That is so cool.
Yeah. Find a stone out of the way, and all this kind of comes open.
Yeah.
Now, is the name Paul? You think that was his name? Maybe
From birth.
From birth. So
Yes, because his parents were Roman citizens.
Right.
And so, I mean, you may remember the account in Acts, where in Acts 23 he's talking to the Roman centurion or Roman soldier, and the Roman soldier says, "Well," Paul says, "I'm a Roman citizen." The centurion says, "Well, I bought my Roman citizenship." Paul says, "I was a Roman citizen from birth because my parents were Roman citizens." Footnote to that, if you want to know how that could have happened, there was outside of Tarsus a Roman legion who was in charge of looking after that area called Cilicia. And what was Paul's business job? He made tents. Who needs tents? Well, a legion of Roman soldiers needs tents. So probably because his family had provided tents and other leather products, sandals, wineskins, bags to tote things in, for that service to the empire, they were granted Roman citizenship, first his parents, and then the son as well, right? And we know, of course, that Paul continued to be a leather worker. We hear about that in Corinth, for example. So now we've got a lot of pieces we've put together, and it certainly makes better sense of the story in Acts, because otherwise, them trekking over those mountains just to get to Pisidian Antioch doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Well, fascinating story, Ben, and all because you were traipsing around in your shorts in northern Turkey.
I was,
right?
and this stone is, it's gathering moss and dirt and all that, and had been there since, well, who knows? We don't know where it was originally.
Yeah, right.
Somewhere in Pisidian Antioch, this was an honorific stone.
Yeah.
That's all we know.
I'm glad it's indoors now.
Yeah, no kidding.
And we'll print a label and ship it over. So
Yeah.
It's all good. Yeah. So, Ben, you've written, 60 books or so on New Testament studies, different topics. So maybe this is an unfair question, but what's your favorite book of the New Testament?
Oh, my goodness. I really love them all, but, if I were to pick a gospel that I enjoy teaching the most, it would be the Gospel of John. And if I were to pick a letter I enjoy teaching the most, it would be Paul's letter to the Romans. And I especially love to see students' eyes light up teaching the book of Revelation. They're going, wow, this is better than the last horror movie I saw.
You're right.
So, I love teaching those books.
Yeah. So the whole range of the New Testament.
Yeah. The funny thing happened when I came to Asbury in 1995. I'd come from Ashland Seminary, where I taught Old Testament and New Testament and Wesley studies, history, doctrine, and polity, and apologetics, right? So I get to Asbury, and David Bauer, the head of the Department of the New Testament, says, well, now, which part of the New Testament would you like to teach? And I went, yes. At least the whole New Testament. You're not going to let me teach the Old Testament, but at least the whole New Testament. Thank you very much.
Right.
That's fun. What made you get into New Testament studies in the first place? Was it a job or?
No, it really wasn't. I had an incredible Bible teacher at Carolina at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Bernard Boyd, through his ministry from 1955 to 1977, sent off over 5,000 undergraduate students to seminaries to train for either teaching or preaching ministry. He was the most charismatic teacher, and he was an archaeologist, hence my interest in archaeology from day one, and a historian. He was basically an Old Testament scholar who found the first horned altar, small horned altar, in Beersheba, in the southern part of Israel.
What's a horned altar?
Well, that's where you apply the blood on the corners of the altar. The four corners have these little horns on them that reach up to God, and that's the closest contact point. That's contact point with God. That's what that is.
We have a small version of that on exhibit in our fifth floor gallery, actually.
Cool.
Exactly. And that's where you go to get sanctuary. You grab the horn on the altar, and you're sacrosanct. Nobody can touch you because you're right there next to God. So ain't happening. You aren't going anywhere, right? So yeah, his teachings were just unbelievable, really incredible. He wanted me to go to Princeton, so I applied and I got into Princeton. But I really wanted to go. Having grown up Methodist, I knew all the mainline stuff because I got taught that all throughout. I'm a cradle Methodist. Mom said my first two words were John Wesley. I kind of doubt that. but I knew the mainline approach to the New Testament. I wanted a good evangelical education. So I went to the place that my neighbor, Billy Graham in Charlotte, told us to go to. They were sponsoring Gordon Conwell Seminary in Massachusetts. So I was the first United Methodist to go to Gordon Conwell Seminary from my area. And I had a fabulous education at Gordon Conwell. Initially, I thought, I'm just training to be a pastor, I did an MDiv, Master's of Divinity, which was then the sort of landmark degree you do if you want to be a pastor. But I also took 13 New Testament classes because they were so good, And at the end of that process, I kind of realized, well, I could preach, or teach, but I'd like to just finish off my studies. I'd like to do a doctoral degree. And this is the point at which my mother objected. You promised me you were coming back to be a pastor in North Carolina. And you know what happened? My grandfather, who never had a college education, interceded with my mom, her father, and said, you leave that boy alone. There's a calling on his life. He needs as much education as he can get. He's going to England. And of course, my mother was fretting about this because I had no money. My wife, Ann, and I were called Little Orphan Annie and Daddy No Bucks. I had $0 after the seminary, nothing. Right after seminary, she said, well, how are you going to pay for this? How are you going to do this? I said, we're moving on faith. I applied for the John Wesley Fellowship, which is why I'm actually here at the museum today. I'm one of the first 5 John Wesley Fellows who were funded before they even had scholarship applications. I was one of the ones that wrote my testimony down. They accepted it. And then in the middle of the summer, after I'd already planned to go to Durham, we'd already been packing and sending off our steamer trucks to Durham, England, right?
Right.
Moving on faith, here comes a brown envelope. And I go to my mailbox and open the envelope. It says, "Congratulations, we're funding you for 3 years of study at the University of Durham." Now, see, this is the first scholarship I had ever won in my life. So I was just sort of leaping and hopping and praising God,
Yes.
you know. And the very first thing I did is I didn't tell my wife. I called up my mother. I said, "Guess what?"
Told you.
Guess what?
Yeah.
And so we were in England for 3 years, and our daughter Christy was born there as well, of blessed memory. And we had 3 wonderful years in England. It was just great. It was great. So I came back, and initially I pastored 4 Methodist churches because we're circuit riders. That's what we do. I had 4, and then they promoted me, so then I had 2. You know, I went from 4 to 2. I would eventually have gotten down to 1 if I had kept going, but at that point I was hired by Ashland Seminary and moved to Northeast Ohio, where I taught for 11 years, and then came to Asbury. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That's a great story.
It's not done yet.
Yeah. So for someone who's interested in studying the New Testament now, where would you recommend they begin?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, if you can avoid it, don't try to do that online. There is such a quantum leap difference between face-to-face education, where you can continue to question the professor and have social contact with fellow students who can help you learn things, and just being the Lone Ranger at home staring at a computer screen. There's such a big difference in in-person education. And especially if you're going to study the Bible, the most important book in human history, you ought to do it right.
Yeah.
Let's not take shortcuts. Let's do it right, you know. So I would say, number one, wherever you go, please do in-person education the best you can. Now, you may have to take some courses online, and that's okay. But it's not okay if you want to find out your vocation in life between pastoring or teaching, that you're not in a place where people can evaluate your maturity as a person or your spiritual formation. See, seminaries have to recommend students to churches. And we so cannot do that if all we know is their academic record.
Right.
Right? That just doesn't work. So find a good seminary if you're at graduate level and get going. Or if you're at undergraduate level, there are lots of great Christian colleges in the country that you can do it at. But I would say, don't pick those that are the easiest places you could go to pick. Pick those that are academically challenging and rigorous. It's important for you get there to teach your mind into active thought, and you want really good teachers of the Bible, and maybe even start taking languages in your undergraduate place in biblical studies. And then when you get to seminary, it's going to be a whole lot easier if you do that, which is what I did. I mean, I'd had 3 years of Latin in high school because I had a remarkable public school education in High Point, North Carolina. But then I took Greek when I went to Carolina, and I took classical Greek and Koinonia Greek as well. And so when I went to seminary, I placed out of elementary Greek and took middle Greek and took Hebrew, which I had not done before. And, it's a blessing. My education has been remarkable. I mean, I studied Romans with Krister Stendahl at Harvard, because when you go to the BTI, the Boston Theological Institute, there's 12 seminaries. You can cross-list courses at any of them. Most of my courses were at Gordon Conwell with Gordon Fee, with Andrew Lincoln, with David Scholler, with Ramsey Michaels. They were world-class New Testament scholars. But I also could go take a course at Princeton with Bruce Metzger, or at Harvard take Romans with Krister Stendahl. I mean, I had the most amazing biblical education before I ever got to doctoral work. And then when I got to Durham, I didn't have to take any classes. I just had to research and write my dissertation. But I took classes with C.K. Barrett, the most famous British Methodist New Testament scholar, with Charles Cranfield, with John Rogerson, who taught Old Testament and had an expertise in the Qumran scrolls. With T.H.A. Parker, was the world's leading expert on Calvin and Luther, had done all their commentaries on Calvin and Luther into English, translated them into English. It was an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah.
It was just unbelievable. And it was also one of the most humbling experiences in my life, because my first Qumran class that I took, these are all undergraduates but me, and they're not Jewish. And I'm going, how in the world are they reading unpointed Hebrew of a photocopy of a Qumran scroll? And it's the British education system. They'd taken Hebrew when they were in what I would call high school, right? They were ready. Now, they were 6 miles deep in biblical languages, but don't ask them about Shakespeare, because the British education is not like an American education. It's very specific from the time you're in junior high. You have to decide what your track's going to be. And, I was just dumbfounded. I was intimidated. They were just rattling off the Hebrew on the Qumran scroll, and I'm going, the tar baby, he ain't going to say nothing. I'm going to just listen to all of this, because my goodness.
Yeah.
And then there was Barrett's seminar. And in his seminar were all these New Testament and Old Testament professors and church historians that I mentioned, and theologians as well. And I had to sit next to Lord Michael Ramsey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who came to the seminar every week with these huge bushy eyebrows, sitting with his little teeny Nestle Aland Greek New Testament, and we studied that, and then we studied the Didache, and each person had to translate the Greek on the spot of a passage, if it was your turn, and then comment on it. So intimidating. Comment
on the archbishops.
Well, exactly. And the day I was doing that, W.D. Davies, a famous New Testament scholar, was at the seminar, and I'm going, okay, let me not mess this up. So I did the translation, nobody objected, and then I gave a tentative explanation of what the passage meant. And then C.K. Barrett, looking around the lexicons at the middle of the table, looking down at my end of the table, said, "And Mr. Witherington, what precisely did you mean by that?" And my instinctive reaction was, honest, sir, I didn't mean nothing. Talk about intimidating. This was intimidating, but it certainly prepared me to be a good teacher.
Well, I still think one of the main reasons to do a PhD is, there's lots of smart people, but the purpose of a PhD is to show you what you don't know. And how much you need to keep studying.
Exactly. And that was my commitment, because in my own tradition, for example, nobody in the Methodist tradition had ever written a commentary on every book of the New Testament.
Really?
Unlike, for example, Calvin or Luther, right? In the Wesleyan tradition, we were all preachers and circuit riders after Wesley. Wesley was a scholar. Asbury was so not a scholar, the one who brought Methodism to America, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
He didn't even have a proper college education. And so the Methodist tradition in America was not a scholarly one at all. And so I felt part of my calling was to write a good commentary on every book of the New Testament for my church, for my denomination, because it had never been done before. And I went, that's stupid. Somebody needs to do it. So, that was part of my mission in life, to do that, and to be a good biblical witness to my own denomination, which was very pluralistic then, and now has just sort of divided into 2, 3, and 4 parts, which is sad.
Yeah. Well, Ben, this is great. Great to kind of get your story, but we do want to advertise the museum. So, off-the-cuff question. We have a huge museum, lots of exhibits, lots of cool things, but what's one thing people have to see when they come to the Museum of the Bible?
Oh, goodness. All 6 floors of the museum. But if I were to pick one thing that would tease the mind into active thought, I'd say go to the Israeli Antiquities Authority exhibit up on the top floor, and come in the door and sit down in the little cubicle to the right and watch the coin
Oh, yeah.
film.
Yeah.
Watch that.
Yeah.
And you will suddenly see how these are little pieces of history that provide clues that open the door to understanding the Bible and biblical culture, both Old and New Testament, and why it's important. I like to say a text without a context is just a pretext for whatever you want it to mean. If you go to an exhibit of archaeological artifacts and coins and all that sort of stuff, you begin to realize, well, maybe context really does matter.
Yeah.
It certainly mattered in that inscription up there in Pisidian Antioch.
Yeah.
They got the context all wrong,
Right.
So that's what I would say. Start there, and if that doesn't tease your mind into active thought, I don't know what will.
Well, it's the largest display of the archaeology of Israel outside of Israel.
Yes. Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Thanks for the segue, because in September we'll have a major archaeology exhibit, which will include some of those little coins to help tell the story. So
That's
come
fantastic.
back in September. Yeah.
Okay, will do.
Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Ben.
And thank you for listening to Today at Museum of the Bible.
Thank you for listening to Today at Museum of the Bible. Join us again to hear how authors, scholars, and leaders are engaging with the Bible every day. Only on Today at Museum of the Bible.